Hi everyone, I'm Tim Bermudez Sanders, he, him, his, and I'm going to be moderating this discussion. Em, do you want to start?
Yeah, my name is Rihl, she, her, hers. I will also be moderating this discussion, and I'm the Access Chair for Change the Stage this year.
Adri, do you want to?
Sure. I'll introduce myself. I'm Adrianna Neefus, and I'll be one of the interpreters today.
Rachel?
I'm Rachel. Oh, hang on, I'm muted.
Sorry, I'm Rachel Judelson, and I'm the other interpreter for today. Thank you.
Mary Elizabeth Peters?
My name is Mary Elizabeth Peters, she, her, hers, and I am here to join our discussion about inclusivity and diversity today.
Jessica?
Hi everyone, I'm Jessica Ernst. I use she, her, hers, and I'm also here to join the discussion. I am a freelance director and producer in Boston.
Betsy?
Hi, I'm Betsy Goldman, she, her, hers pronouns. I'm here to join the discussion. EJ and I have been working together for a long time. I'm an educator, director, dramaturg in the Boston area.
And last but not least, EJ?
Hi, everyone. My name is Elbert Joseph. People call me EJ for short. And I use he, him, his for pronouns. And I am an ASL consultant. I'm an advocate. I work with Jessica. I work with Betsy. I have a lot of different roles that I play, but I'm also an actor, and I'm involved in all of those different components of theater.
Sweet.
And thank you all for inviting me to be part of this.
Thank you all for being here so much. I'm going to start off with a question about season programming. So we've talked about this a little bit in our planning meetings. So what does intersectionality look like in season programming? And just shout out your answers and we can kind of go from there.
I think it might be most important to define what intersectionality is, because the more people that I work with, the more it feels as though not everybody has the same definition for intersectionality. So I think that's a really important place to start in terms of season planning, is what is intersectionality to the people planning the season.
Interesting.
I agree.
I think along with what Betsy is saying, for the people planning the season, I think each arts organization needs to think about their audience too. And where does their audience land now in terms of what they would think intersectionality means, and where are they trying to take their audience in terms of that word or that discussion? I think that's a really good point, Betsy.
Are there identities that are being that you see are being left out of that term right now? And what are those identities?
Absolutely. Yes. There are some sectionalities that are being left out, and during some performances, that's visible. You can see who's not there, who's not part of the intersectionality. It's not all about who's on stage at any given time. It's about identity and who you are, and you can recognize that in companies, who's on stage and who isn't.
And reflecting the audience on the stage as well.
Mm.
One thing I think about a lot when I'm considering the kind of work that I want to create as a theater artist, as well as the kind of work I want to see on stage, I think it's important for us to pay attention to the fact that when theater companies program a season, who are the voices in the room during the programming discussions? As much as many of our organizations are striving and are making progress in representation on stages in casts, in directors, in design teams, in writers, there's still a really sizable power imbalance, I think, between who is hired and who does the hiring. And while obviously that's a problem whose solution is a longer term one, I think that it's important for those of us who find ourselves in positions of power when it comes to programming to recognize that imbalance. It doesn't mean necessarily that we can't do that work responsibly, but it does mean that if we're committed to striving for greater equity, it's on the people who are in that position of programming power to do the legwork and find the voices to bring them in on the discussions of programming early on, rather than simply making a list of plays, hiring people from diverse backgrounds and saying our work here is done.
Mm-hmm.
I completely agree with Jessica in terms of, where you want to go? You want to go first? You can go first.
I agree with that as well. No, that's...
Yeah. Well, I was going to say that, I think what Jessica's speaking to a little bit and what Betsy and everyone's saying is that there's a complexity to this idea of intersectionality, and that, what I'm drawn to as an artist and what I'm drawn to as a producer and a playwright is that complexity. And that, I think what we're all trying to do is move past this idea of it within a season, for example, doing one play and having it be like the deaf play we're doing, or having one play within a 6-show season and having it be the Black play that's being done by a company. Not to talk, in such terms, but that's kind of what we saw through, the late 90s, the early 2000s, and we're moving past that in some areas, but in some areas we're not. We're seeing companies that still kind of have that idea of a very simplistic view of representation, and not, as Jessica was saying, not getting all the voices in the representation in the room to plan, just getting them in the room for the product. And that's kind of a weak level that we all want something more than that now.
Yes, and I would like to contribute to that also when it comes to intersectionality, you need to have a full understanding of the culture, especially if it's a linguistic culture, which is my experience, that every culture and the language you use around the culture, every culture has its own language. And not everybody uses the same language when they talk about their culture, and so you need to be careful that you're speaking the right way about something so that you're not oppressing people further or squelching people. For example, in the deaf community, we're very direct. That's normal. And it's not us being rude or being blunt in any way. It's just part of our culture. And so we need some sensitivity around the culture itself and getting some perspective in terms of what's normal, what isn't. And that'll be part of intersectionality as well, to have people see that there are differences. And we want the audience to see that as well. We want the audience to be reflected in the people on stage, and we want them to be learning from what they see in those performances. That languages are used differently amongst cultures. Cultures use languages differently. And so we can't be using any one culture as a base. We all need to come together. So
maybe to kind of, not sum up, but to offer a suggestion in terms of season planning, I think it has to start with bringing the voices into the room that you are looking to highlight and uphold. Before you pick the plays, before you pick the issues, before you pick whatever it is that you think intersectionality is, get those voices in the room. Because those humans are the humans who are going to be able to represent themselves and what they believe. And it's like Jess is saying, you can't just plop it on stage. And Mary Elizabeth saying this, you can't just say, well, I got EJ in a play. Didn't I do it? Did I do it?
Yeah, are we good now?
You have to get those voices in at the very beginning. They must be involved in the planning process.
Exactly. I get that all the time. All. But I do want to talk about Jessica, her point. But I also want her to share her personal experience with working with me and what her process in terms of casting deaf artists is. And I want to make sure that we get that heard as well.
Sure. Thank you so much, EJ. And I'd be happy to talk about the work we're doing right now. So for those of you who don't know, EJ and I, and Betsy as well, are currently collaborating on a really exciting adaptation of Shakespeare's The Tempest. I'm working with a new theater company called Queen Mab that is creating micro theater, taking the idea of adapting classics for very small casts, so for 3 or fewer actors, and creating highly creative, professional, fully realized productions that can pack up and fit in a van and go wherever they need to go. And what EJ and his castmates and Betsy and the rest of our ASL team are working on is an adaptation of Shakespeare's The Tempest, where 3 actors play 12 characters and where a considerable amount of Shakespeare's text is actually translated into and performed in sign language. For example, one of the characters EJ plays is Ariel, who is the spirit who works with Prospero in The Tempest, and virtually all of Ariel's lines are translated into and performed in sign. And it's a really ambitious, exciting project, and it's been quite a journey. It actually began when, when was this? Time has no meaning. I think it was June, May, almost a year ago of last year.
Yes.
Something like
yes,
that.
that's right.
Yeah. And
Almost
this
a
idea
year ago.
Yeah.
And I remember auditioning.
Yes.
Betsy, you were there.
Yes.
And we had interpreters and advocates for that entire experience.
Yeah.
Well, I was both interpreter and advocate. That's what that was.
Oh, thank you, Betsy, for the clarification. That was an interpreter error.
Yeah, and so this was back when I just had this very nascent idea that I wanted to do an adaptation of The Tempest for this company. And EJ came in with a rough translation of Ariel's side and performed it for an audition. And I'm a director, and anyone who's worked with me or seen my work knows that I generally like new and creative and highly theatrical work. So, seeing EJ perform Shakespeare in sign language, my immediate response was, well, what am I going to do? Leave that on the table? That's the coolest thing I've ever seen.
We all react that way to EJ. We all do.
It was just such an exciting artistic experience. And that was where the idea for incorporating sign and exploring how deafness and language could become a part of this adaptation came from. It was from following that excitement. And it's all very new to me. This is the first time, this process is the first time I've worked with and directed a deaf actor. So it's definitely been a learning process. And EJ and Betsy and everyone I've worked with have been really generous with their time and expertise. So it's ongoing. Kristen Johnson is our director of artistic sign language, and she's done the translation of the lines within the text. We just had a virtual workshop a couple weeks ago where we continued sort of exploring it, and hopefully fingers crossed, in the not too distant future, we'll be able to, you know, get this thing on its feet in person.
I just want to respond to something that I think is extremely important that Jessica said, and it's not exactly what you said. It's the fact that you are being extremely honest about your experience. And I think my experience in working with people who are trying to have this sort of vague goal of inclusivity, don't say, I don't know what I'm doing. Don't say, this is my first time doing this. There's this like ego that makes them want to protect their own knowledge that ends up ruining the whole thing. And what I've appreciated so much about Jess, and what I appreciated about Lindsay Eagle, who did something similar with Antigone a few years ago, is that they were like, I don't know what I'm doing. Guide me, you know, and not, you must guide me, this is your job, but would you please be a part of this? Is this something you would be interested in assisting me with? I don't know, and I want to do it the right way, or I want to do it the best way we can come up with right now. And I think that's imperative, because we only know our own inclusivity and our own experiences, our own subjectivity. And that's why other people's voices are so imperative. Voices, you know, speaking or signing, right? And I think that, to me, that's what's been really wonderful about working with Jessica and Queen Mab, is they're like, let's figure it out together, but let's figure it out the right way, and not let's patch things together pretending that we know what we're doing.
Yeah, I think that what Betsy's speaking to that I really appreciate is that what we wonder from companies, and we wonder from directors like Jessica, and wonder from casting directors and producers and actors in the room is, you know, can we be brave and try something new and see what happens? And not this kind of hubris that comes along with being an artist that can be very healthy. But sometimes people at the top levels have had so much of that rewarding what they have done for a long time, that doing something new is scary, and that to really embrace identities and really, you know, grapple with identity, including ability, race, gender, expression of gender, expression of sexuality, all those things, you need to be brave and try some things new, and not just a new production, but how can rehearsal be different? How can season selection be different? How can casting be different? How can the team we put together, you might need different people in the room to make a play if you're grappling with identity in an authentic way. It might not just be a director, a stage manager, and actors, you know? You might need more voices to bring something to life that you haven't thought of before. I mean, we're looking for bravery, you know?
Yes, and
Okay.
I'd like to contribute to that as well. I think that sorry to pick on you, Betsy, but I think you're a perfect person to speak to this, because you have studied ASL, and so you're aware of the culture, you're aware of the language itself, you have this cognizance that, what am I trying to say, that you're not worried about status, you're not worried about,
You're not taking sides.
thank you, you're not taking sides, you're mediating, and trying to make sure that both cultures are represented well. Hearing theater and deaf theater are coming together in a way that works for both sides. So that's something that you're especially strong at, that I wish more people were. I'm very thankful to Betsy for that. She's able to talk to directors, producers, all the people on the team, and she does that sort of liaison work that allows me to focus on my job. And it's so helpful to have somebody in that role who knows both worlds, who has both languages, and really understands what does inclusivity mean. And so I would encourage more people to be growing your knowledge, to have a wider understanding of these things and keep an open mind.
And just one last quick comment, because I know that Em had something to share, but just to piggyback off of what EJ was saying about, growing growing your experience and growing your knowledge. For me, the fact that we began this work at the very beginning of the production development process has been a crucial piece of it, because it's meant that rather than coming in partway through pre-production and trying to stick something onto a piece of theater that's been created in a very sort of traditional hearing theater way, it's been involved in the production process from the beginning in the same way that the script has been, that the design concept has been, so that all of this has this very like holistic relationship. Every piece is connected to each other, right. Which I, at least for me personally, I think has helped to make things more approachable, because of course it's intimidating to learn something new and challenging and outside your experience, but by connecting it to the development of the production as a whole, to me it operates in a similar way as any other new theatrical tool I have learned. I have had to learn how to incorporate projection design into shows before. There's a first time for that. There's a first time you direct Shakespeare. There's a first time you direct a musical. So considering this idea of working with, deaf theater and incorporating sign language and incorporating other identities or other abilities that may require modifications to be really truly included, I think it's helpful for those of us who don't come from those communities to consider that work as just part of our artist's toolbox, as part of the work we're doing. It's a new thing to learn to create your work.
Yeah, exactly right.
I think this perfectly segues into our next question, because I'm sitting here and I'm listening to Jessica speak, and I'm wondering, what was the feedback from the, the company as a whole, when you were like, I want to do this way. And we have a question about, it says like, what do you have to say to someone who is tired of fighting for representation and opportunity in this business? But I don't even think it has to be someone who is tired of. I think someone who's never even thought of it before. And you bring them this idea, and then how do they respond to it? And how do you advocate for it? So I think, and I think, you probably all have experience with this. So I think if you can touch upon that a little bit when you're working with an institution, in forming a theater piece.
Well, this particular experience is a little bit of an outlier, I think, as, if the question is more about sort of bringing this idea to an existing institution, because Queen Mab is brand new, and it's a one-man and a board operation. Ben Evatt is the artistic director, and he and I have been colleagues and friends for quite a long time. He and EJ have worked together before, so when EJ came into audition for us, and Ben and I were like, okay, well, we're gonna figure this out. So it wasn't really the dynamic of me as an artist having to convince an existing institution with a set of policies and procedures in place. It was because it's a startup company, because it's in its first year or two, there's a level of flexibility. We may not have much cash on hand to just, hire whoever we need to, but the flip side of that is the flexibility to say like, okay, here's what we need, as opposed and sort of mold our approach and tailor it. So I'm lucky in that my experience with doing this work for the first time hasn't really necessitated a great deal of convincing. But I'm sure that other folks in this group who've worked with more established institutions may be able to speak to that better.
Looked like Betsy was gearing up to say something, but I'm not sure. Because I was going to share that I think that, I was thinking about this question a lot since our last meeting about the idea of identity and artistry and how to get work and keep work and sustain yourself as an artist while being your true identity. And it's a difficult thing to grapple with, right? I think the world has changed a lot. I mean, 20 years ago, if you looked at the graduating class of theater actors at BU and Emerson and Yale and NYU, they would all look remarkably the same, like how could the blonde girls get skinnier and how could the tall men be taller and how could the white people be whiter and and things have changed a lot. As you can tell, I just answer the questions as bluntly as I can, but like things have changed a lot in that way. We have more identities that are coming out of theater schools and are entering the artistic space and entering the artistic space without that formalized education. And I think, the original question is, what would your advice be to someone who's tired of fighting to see their identity on stage, to be their identity on stage? I think the biggest piece of advice is to be more fully yourself and to be more authentic in your representation of who you are on and off stage, in the way that you market yourself, in the way that you shoot your headshot, in the way that you do your website, in the shows you choose to audition for, in the artists you choose to work with, really developing that sense of identity in your work throughout. Now, that comes with some privilege. You also have to take work where you can get it, So it's kind of a complex issue, but being more fully authentically yourself in all of the realms, I think, is the biggest piece of advice to serve who you are as an artist, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, can I contribute to that? I mean, everyone's familiar with me, and you know that I'm getting tired. And what I mean is not physically tired, and I'm not done. You know what I mean? It's just this has been bubbling in me for so long. This sense of frustration and anger because I hear the same thing over and over. Right? It's like a recording. And I keep wondering to myself, people tell me that, and they tell me every time it's the same thing. But why do they keep saying that? You don't want me to grow. You don't want me to excel in any way. You just want me to be who I am. But are you afraid of something? You want me to be something safe? So I've decided, I know that anger is something that people have a hard time working with, but I've decided not to give it up. You know what I mean? I've decided to stay.
To keep my integrity.
To stay who I am and to keep my integrity. And that's important to me. My integrity is very important to me. And I feel that I'm going to be led by that integrity to do great things and to do the right thing. So I guess that speaks to your point as well, but that's something that I wanted to say.
What I love is it connects so much to what you were saying at the beginning about the differences in culture and the differences in language. Like you're saying that, you have this anger in you, and there are other cultural battles where they would say, get mad and stay mad, so how can that anger be good for you? But then also we're in a space where sometimes, whether it is deaf people, whether it is Black people, whether it is women, but different identities are told, you're too loud, you're too big, you're too much. If you could just be sweeter and nicer and calmer and quieter, then we could really work with you. But because you're so this other thing, it was a little bit, I can't deal with that. So there's sort of a power in it, right? But then there's this issue of culture, and that people really need to be open to culture. They need to be open to culture in a big way, not in a, well, we like you here, but only if you're sweet and quiet and polite about the way that you're here, you know?
Right.
So it's you bring up so many good points.
Absolutely. And just to be clear, this anger that I have, this frustration, is Rachel, would you mind taking this? I'm having video quality issues.
I'm sorry, EJ, hold on one second. I'm just having trouble seeing EJ. He's a bit small for me. Can I ask a question real quick? If I pin EJ, will that mess up the recording?
No,
No.
Right,
'cause
hold-
it'll just be on your screen.
Also, Rachel, I pinned EJ and now the quality is less, so see what happens on your end.
Great. EJ, I can see you now. Go ahead, please. EJ saying, so I would just like to be clear with everybody that the anger that I have and the emotion that I carry it's really, the better word is umbrage. It's about motivation. It's about passion. My passion for the work, my passion for inclusion, my passion is burning in me as an artist, as a human all the time. And so that gives me ample opportunity to think about my integrity and what that means to me and how I can portray it on stage and off.
Yeah, I don't have an answer. I'm just sort of thinking out loud here, which is that if you're an activist all the time. You're not just going to stop because people are bumping up against you. You're not doing it just for the theater, you're doing it for everything. So if you believe in inclusivity, then you're fighting for inclusivity on every single level in every single cell. I'm not just gonna, and part of being an activist is getting exhausted and getting angry and thinking about passion and integrity and what fuels you. I completely agree with what Mary Elizabeth is saying in terms of some people aren't allowed to be angry in the room with you, right? EJ's not allowed to be angry. EJ's not allowed to be passionate because it scares people. And I have the privilege of being able to be angry and passionate. But I guess all I'm trying to say is, if you're an activist, you're an activist, whether or not you continue to bump up against it. And that's part of what becoming an activist means, is figuring out how to navigate. And yeah, that's sort of where I'm going.
Yeah. Yep.
So to kind of go off of that, there's a lot of, so I'm hearing anger, I'm hearing frustration. And so where do we need to focus that energy to create the greatest change in our industry? Where's the greatest locus of change, in your opinion? Where should we be expressing that frustration? Where should we be, everywhere. And where do you think we can create the greatest change with that frustration?
On the broadest terms, I think it's about hiring.
Mm-hmm.
On the micro level, in our industry, we're talking about casting and the designers that we hire, right? Mm-hmm. But on the bigger level, we're talking about who heads companies and who heads our theater companies, who are the heads of our museums, who are the heads of our arts organizations, who are the education directors, what are their identities, what are their intersectionalities, and where do they fall on what Betsy and EJ are speaking to so strongly, which is activism. It's one thing to have an identity and keep it to yourself. And it's another thing to have an identity, to recognize other identities and to fight for those other identities. So those are not always the same. It's not always the same person. You can own an identity and fight for no one. And that doesn't do any good for our industry, which is a little bit what EJ and I were talking about in our planning meeting with us, that you can have representation at the top of a company because it looks a certain way or it meets a certain demographic. But if that doesn't follow through to an activism throughout the hiring in an arts organization or throughout the representation on stage or the representation in the art, then so what? Mm-hmm. So that's what I think. I think the biggest focus is in hiring.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's also something to push for in the realm of funding. One frequent challenge that folks come up against is that it takes more resources to do things differently. Often proper inclusion practices do require more resources. That doesn't mean you can't do them. It means they have to be on your budget from the beginning, because if you put something in your budget, then it's in your budget. That's how that works. But the challenge is that, you know, particularly in the greater Boston area, you know, we're in a situation where funding for the arts is, you know, compared to similarly sized cities, incredibly limited. The grants that are available to theater companies and smaller organizations in particular are very small, very few, and very competitive. So I think there could be a really interesting direction to mine with, you know, conversations with the philanthropic community and with the arts philanthropy in the city about, okay, we, you know, the artists who have been tying everything together with shoelaces in order to give you something to watch and to enjoy and be inspired by for so long, we want to do this work to make our stages more inclusive, to make our work stronger and more equitable. And one of the things that's holding us back is that we have to choose between inclusion and other elements of our art, and that is wrong. Can we get some movement in the philanthropic community to provide grants specifically to fund, for example, you know, an entire rehearsal process's worth of ASL interpreting services, or to fund a position of a director of artistic sign language. There are some grants. StageSource has a grant that specifically funds performance interpreting, which is a really great start and hugely important, but you know, and this is of course top of mind for me right now because I'm working with and tinkering with a budget that is quite small, that relies very heavily on grant funding, and being like, okay, well, this is what these numbers are. There are these many budget lines. You know what would be great? If there was a grant I could apply for that would single-handedly take care of this one. And having that kind of specific available funding would make it so much easier. It would essentially remove the excuse. Because, you know, because that's what it is. You know, it's true. Hiring people costs money. And, you know, if we remove the idea that you have to choose between a designer and an interpreter, how many more people would actually, you know, be able to do this kind of ambitious and inclusive work?
If you want your production to have projection design, you figure out a way to hire that projection designer.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
By the way, I want to make it very clear that I am trying my darndest not to swear right now.
You're doing a good job.
I have the mouth of a sailor. Just warning you now.
We're all doing a good job.
You're exactly right, Betsy. And that's what I mean about, like, if you put it in your budget, magically it's there.
Also, like, to speak to what Betsy's saying too, I think, and to what Jessica was saying, a lot of it is a philosophical choice that has been made by theater companies or arts organizations. We keep talking about theater because we're theater people in the room, right? But arts organizations, that inclusivity, representation, access, that these things are extras, and that they are philanthropic, lovely things to offer and to brag about.
Right.
I mean, I know when I was running the Accessible Theater, we were not exclusively, but more than half of what we did was provide access training to arts organizations. And some of the arts organizations, which I will not name, that have millions and millions of dollars, ones that like have to go to court and prove their not-for-profit status and stuff would be like, could you do 5 trainings for, we could pay you like $50 per training. And it was like, that's hours and hours of work and 3 staff people and materials and transportation and all this other stuff. And it's a philosophy. It was like a philosophical block. Like, can't you just come do it for free? Well, no, we can't. And not because we, if the world didn't have money, we would come do it for free. But the world does take money, and doing things costs money, and people deserve to be paid for their work. So yeah, part of it is just a philosophical change that needs to happen. And if this is something you want in your work, then you need to put it in that spreadsheet.
And like, just in my experience, people always associate disability and charity,
Right.
which drives me insane. Like, always, like, my whole life has driven me insane because people are like, oh, well, if it's for like the disabled community, it's charity. So that's why they think they can get away with like free stuff. But that's not the case. You're servicing a community, you're servicing humans. You have to be able to pay them or pay for your services and be able to do it correctly. It's not like a volunteer thing. You're not being like, you're not.
If you can have an opening night and put out champagne and $1,000 worth of Gouda cheese, you can pay someone to come and train your staff over a 3-day weekend. And I love cheese, but you can't pay the rent with it.
Exactly. Yes, absolutely. That's why when I hear that kind of thing, I'm like, wait a minute, where are you getting your money from? Why is it that you're saying you don't have any when you're saying you can't afford all of these things that should be givens, but you're spending money on champagne? Absolutely.
It's funny. The more we sort of travel back down this rabbit hole, the more it feels as though it has to happen at the tiniest and most instrumental levels. The shift in ideology, the shift in philosophy, the shift in where people hold others in their minds and in their hearts, because and it connects. It's like what Mary Elizabeth was talking about in terms of hiring. It connects, because if you're just hiring people for the look to fill the slot, then the ideology and the philosophy may never change. But that part of what we're talking about right now is good old-fashioned oppression and discrimination on a human-to-human level and on a business, organizational level.
I agree with that. Yeah, and the problem that let me just say the concern I have, actually that might be the wrong word. Let me say my issue. I'm going to use the word issue. The issue that I have about that is that I'm wondering why a producer, for example, a producer or a director or a casting director, what have you, why they wouldn't go into communities to go to workshops, to host courses, to learn about intersectionality, to learn about inclusivity, to learn about inclusive casting, and really get an understanding of what that means from the other side of the table, to have those discussions on a deep level, on an open level. I don't see that happening at all. I feel like people who make the decisions are happy with making things look a certain way, checking a certain box, and they're not taking part in these actual rich discussions that are happening out there in the community on the street. If they went out and tried to bridge these gaps to the communities, I think they would learn a lot. And I'm not seeing casting directors and producers going into the communities where people live and do the work. They're saying, oh, I have, whomever, I can check a box or several boxes and I'm done. And so then it seems to me that they're not learning. The people in the room who make the decisions are not taking advantage of opportunities to learn more and do better.
I also feel like, if we're talking from a budgeting point of view and from a revenue point of view, these are more humans, more butts in seats, right? If you're represented on stage, you're more likely to go support that representation or to feel like you're being invited to be part of the community. And this is an argument that I hear over and over again. And people bump up against, well, that takes work, right? And again, I'll use projection design. Oh, you'll invest in two high tech long throw projectors that you've found the money for, but you won't invest in 2 years worth of ASL interpreters for 2 nights of a show, right? So those projectors, how many people are they bringing to your show versus access, and ideally access that is built in from the beginning, not just ASL interpreters for 2 nights of a show, but access built in from the beginning is going to bring in so many more people.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that I just want to make sure, if we're inviting people, if we're inviting designers into the process or hiring designers, for example, into the process, how can we use access for the set, for example, for the lights? How can we think about access in every level of production design? So it's not just about, it being an afterthought, access being an afterthought, or whomever, inclusion being an afterthought, that it's thought of in the beginning and baked into the process.
Yeah, this idea of access from the beginning and inclusion from the beginning, I think, is really the root of where change will come from, within the people for whom it's a new experience. For those of us who do come from more privileged communities, doing the work ourselves to reframe the way we think, to decenter the idea of the most privileged identity and experience as the default and anything else being an addition, is in fact work. It's unlearning lots and lots of cultural training, and it can be uncomfortable. But I'm sorry, I this is about to get super like theater jargony, but I kind of can't help myself. So one of the processes that has been a huge influence on my work as a director is the way Tectonic Theater Project does moment work.
I was going to ask you to talk about this.
Yeah, really? It's like, me, Betsy. But, and one of the sort of cornerstones of that idea is that the 2 things that I find really important about that in regards to this discussion are, first, this sort of communal approach to creation, that while there may be a director and there may be a writer who have, perspectives that are drivers, everyone in the room has the ability and the responsibility to be an integral part of creation and to have their voice part of it. And the second element is sort of writing the whole production, where you consider from the very beginning of your process the storytelling capacities of light, of sound, of scenic design, of text, of movement. And I think that the more we can train ourselves to add on of ability, of language, of, all of these different bigger things that make our world richer, that make our art richer, by including them, if we can have that that mindset of this is all of a piece. Nothing is just removed and tacked on. It's all part of the same whole. Then the work is better, and the better we get at that work, the more inclusive the work is as well.
To add on to that, I think one of the great things about that work, about the Tectonic Theater Project work, is also that it's about perspective taking, right? So that we're not just looking at the piece of art through the eyes of the director, or sometimes through the eyes of the playwright, or sometimes through the eyes of the protagonist or the lead, but that we see things through multiple perspectives, and that's how your audience should or usually does experience your play, right? But isn't that also how we could build a play, how we could build a piece of art with multiple perspectives, really having a voice, not just like, oh, well, there's going to be this person in the audience, there's going to be that person in the audience, let's think about them a little bit, but really investing time in the art making in that perspective taking. And getting that in the room from the beginning, which is what you're doing with your project, which is so lovely.
We have to wrap up pretty soon, but if I could just go around, if I could just, one final question really quick. What is one thing that you want to say to young theater artists that maybe don't feel like their voices are being heard right now? And we can just go around the room. Let's start with Betsy. Oh, sorry.
No, I mean, I guess the best thing that I can say to a young actor, heard or not heard, is trust yourself, listen to yourself, find those people who will support you and keep them close, keep fighting, and if you're tired, come talk to me and we'll hang out and we'll figure it out. But I think one of the most important things for young people is to know that their guts are imperative, both in performing and in finding their paths.
Thank you. Mary Elizabeth?
Sure. I think I agree with Betsy. I think if you're a young artist or a new artist of any age and you're coming into this realm, it's a new chapter in your life, find your tribe. It might not be the majority tribe, it might not be the biggest tribe or the prettiest tribe or the tribe getting the most work and making the most money, but find your peers and find the work that fits you. And if you can't find the work, make the work. Which is what Jessica's doing. Make something and the Queen Mab project is doing with Ben Ebbett. If you don't find the work out there to be part of, create the work yourself, which can be really, really hard, but it's really, really rewarding. So those are my 2 pieces of advice.
Sweet. Jessica?
I would say to anyone who's coming up or who is trying to change their practice to be more inclusive, to be brave and humble in equal measure, to not be to be brave enough to take a leap and try something that seems a little scary and new and strange and difficult, but to be humble enough to admit that that's what you're doing, and to admit that you don't necessarily have all the answers, but you are willing to do the work to seek them.
Thank you. And EJ?
Wow. Oh my gosh. I mean, everybody's got such good answers, and where do I even begin? I have so many thoughts. Okay, so one thing I would say for sure is that I think as someone who is starting out or someone who's struggling to find their place, they need to find their tribe. I agree with that 100%. We need to find our peers and stay in contact with each other. And then I would also say, really, really trust your peers. Trust the people that you have in your corner who who will listen to you, who will support you, who will share their opinions with you honestly. That's those two things I would say, because that tribe, those people who support you, who are in your corner, support who you are and help you grow. And then I also would say, challenge yourself. Challenge yourself in as many ways as you can, because the arts are not and should not be comfortable. They shouldn't be comfortable. It shouldn't be easy. Art should be risky. It should be dangerous. And in that way, it's beautiful. And in that way, art comes from inside of us all. It's an expression of our humanity. And so it's very important. And so that's what I would say. And I'll add something else. And. The truth. Be truthful with yourself. Be honest with yourself and truthful with yourself.
All right. Thank you all so much for being here. This was fantastic. I'm going to go ahead and stop recording now. Thank you all so much for being here.